Dr. Geehr, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me. Your work is absolutely incredible, and I think that this conversation is really exciting, really enlightening, and maybe probably elicit a lot of different feelings, honestly. But you're in a world where you're questioning a narrative because often in this world of the science is settled and the religion of science, we're not allowed to ask questions and things just don't pass the sniff test. So, with that being said, your book, the new book that came out, Unavoidably Unsafe for Adults, I think that is a key distinction because the conversation is typically around kids, which I am a daddy of four little ones, varying vaccine statuses. And we can get into that a little bit more. There is a
Okay.
massive difference that I've seen. But if you don't care, give us that little bit of an introduction to who you are, and we're going to break down this incredible work that you have been putting out there.
Sure. I'm a conventionally trained physician. I was an undergraduate at Yale where I did pre-med and I got my medical degree from Duke and I did my postgraduate training at UCLA and I became board certified in emergency medicine. You couldn't get any more sort of standard than that and practiced for a number of years and then went on to the more the administrative side. And I actually ended up working for a pharmaceutical company. So I got to see the industry from both sides of the fence. And when the COVID epidemic came along, as I was looking at the data that was coming out, and I was looking at the design of the vaccines and the strange characteristics of the actual virus, it just didn't seem right to me. It just my antenna were way up on that. And as I dug more and more, what I found was amazing um, planning, duplicity, falsehoods, suppression of people's rights and speech. My own license was threatened in the state of California for proposing some alternative therapies for COVID, which ended up being very successful. I was kind of found myself on the front lines of this issue. And as a result, you start networking with other doctors who are raising questions. 95% of doctors weren't raising any questions at all. They were going along with it. And we can talk a little bit more about that later in terms of what's been changing in healthcare and why that's happening, why doctors were so compliant. But the group of us, so we started networking and communicating, and that's where I teamed up with Dr. Parkey, who's my co-author on this. Jeff's got a very busy, thriving practice here in California, and he's again conventionally trained, but kind of a holistic physician. And he had always been skeptical of vaccines, and the more we dug into it, the more we realized that it wasn't just a COVID vaccine that was an issue. All of the vaccines had major flaws in them in terms of their evolution and how they were brought to market. So that's kind of how I got to this spot. Had a, again, conventional training. I was in academic medicine for a while, so teaching other doctors, and then was in the pharmaceutical industry. So it gave me kind of a unique background for digging into this.
Yeah. Let's go into a little bit of that from the public perspective. I feel like we're supposed to just trust, and then we have our physicians that just trust the science. So, what are your ideas on faith and trust versus looking at, uh, for lack of a better term, the data?
The core issue here in medicine, as it is for most things, but certainly for healthcare, is informed consent. And informed consent means that an individual who is subject to a procedure or a drug or a vaccine is given sufficient information that they can understand that allows them to make an independent decision about the risks and benefits for them, not for a group, not for the population, but for them and for their children. And it really is that issue about how you become informed that is entirely lacking right now in the process in healthcare. In fact, it was interesting. I was reading the other day that One of the complaints that was coming out of the American Academy of Pediatrics is that if doctors had to explain all of the risks and benefits to their patients, they wouldn't have enough time. And so that tells you, that speaks volumes as to what's happened to healthcare, is that you're really on a conveyor belt now of protocols and vested interests that are driving this process. Doctors who are now 80% employed, whereas they used to be 20% employed back when I first started. They have to toe the party line because their paycheck depends on it. So they're not going to rock the boat. Plus, listen, it's a hassle. Um, every doctor should read the package insert that comes with every drug or vaccine they administer. And I can tell you they don't. About 1% of physicians or fewer actually read those package inserts, which by law have to describe the risks and benefits and the studies that were done to bring it to market. And even then, they're deficient, but at least get through that information. That's why in the book that you held up toward the end, I talk about how to use the information in that package insert to your benefit, of really requiring the doctor to explain certain things to you. And I outline that in a very easy to understand format.
You've done a phenomenal job on the book. So one thing that I've come to believe wholeheartedly is that we can't actually understand science without understanding the history of science. And so I want to jump back into something that you covered in your book. I want to know if you agree with that assessment. But when we have this conversation around the polio vaccine, it is treated by the public as one of the greatest accomplishments of all time. Jonas Salk is a hero, but you do a really good job in laying out the story of Bernice Eddy, of SV40 contamination, of the smoke and mirrors. You know, I think it continues to go much deeper, and more nefarious, in my opinion, especially when you bring in like the work, Alton Oshner into the mix and everything that happened in the New Orleans area. But what are your thoughts on that? The history of science is so important to actually understand science, and then the story around the greatest deception, in my opinion, in, the mid 1900s.
Sure. The history of science is fascinating. It's fits and starts. It is wacky ideas, some of which prove to be correct and some of which prove to be dangerous. The introduction of vaccines in the 1700s killed far more people than smallpox did at that time. And so we have this record where we look back and there's a concept. For example, if you take vaccines, the concept is, it makes sense that if you introduce a portion of that bacteria or virus into the system, sensitize the immune system to that fragment so it can be alert for future infections. That kind of makes sense. And for some things, it actually works. But um, but if you but what was built over time was, and this, the history repeats itself over and over again. Once an idea is adopted, it not only becomes sort of common lore, but it becomes common law. So that vaccines, for example, have been, since they were created, have been mandated for populations, even when the vaccines are proven dangerous. And so the history of smallpox, which I don't cover in my book, but other books have done an admirable job doing, is one such example where it was a very dangerous vaccine. It harmed far more people than it helped, and caused tremendous infection. And people were actually jailed or abandoned, really, if they refused to become vaccinated. And people were fleeing cities where this mandate occurred. This was typically in Britain at the time, but then migrated to this country as well. Polio is a classic example of this phenomenon. So the history of polio, at least in our country, is that there really wasn't polio that popped up in our country until the late 1800s. And it was in a little town north of Boston where there was an outbreak of paralysis among not only children, but adults as well. And Uh, and what was also happening at the time, as it turned out, is that the gypsy moth had been imported into this country on ships from England. It was not a native species. And when the gypsy moth arrived here, it devoured our plant life. It went through the trees, it went into farms, devastated crops, and so forth. And so the pharmaceutical industry, or the neonatal, the early drug industry at the time, came up with a solution that would kill the moths. That was a sticky, gooey substance that could be sprayed on crops and trees. What was made of lead arsenate. In other words, lead and arsenic were combined to kill the insect. Now, it killed the insects for sure, but for example, vegetables, apples, and things, you couldn't wash this off, were being consumed by people. And so as this polio quote outbreak occurred, it tracked along the use of lead arsenate in the fields and in the crops. The next time it popped up was actually in Rutland, Vermont, a few years later, where a pharmacist in Rutland, and it was very rural at the time. Its fruit trees were really the staple crop up there in Vermont at the time, pears and apples and so forth. A pharmacist in Rutland, Vermont, saw this outbreak of the moth species in Massachusetts and said, "I'm going to whip up a batch of this stuff and give it to our farmers." Which he did. He whipped up 50 gallons of lead arsenate. He distributed it out to the farmers to use on their crops. And then all of a sudden, you're having an outbreak of polio. Now, it not only affected children and adults, but horses and cows and other things that were exposed to the lead arsenate. But this was all interpreted as polio. This settled down for a while. And then the next big outbreak, the major outbreak that occurred, was in New York City. I think it was in around 1916, where you had an outbreak in the city that spread out from the city into Staten Island. You had a couple hundred deaths. Actually, no, I'm sorry. You had 10 deaths. You had several thousand infections. Um, but in Staten Island, they were using lead arsenate at the time. But in New York, what was interesting is that there was research being done on the polio virus at the time. Something they were doing what's called serial passage through animal culture cells. And this is to look at whether or not they can change the infectiousness of the virus. And what they did is they leaked the polio virus into the environment. That's the theory right now, is that that was the original source of the spread in New York City. And in addition, it hit the tenement communities pretty bad because they, again, had poor sanitation to begin with and so forth. But all of this was interpreted as the viral outbreak of polio, and the search was on to find cures. But there were repeated outbreaks then throughout the mid 1900s, culminating in the early 1950s, 40s and 50s, um, where you had outbreaks that were hitting tens of thousands of people at a time. You had all these kids in iron lungs. You had this whole phenomenon. And so the race was on to get the vaccine made. But what was also happening at the time is that although they had discovered by this time in the mid 19th century that lead arsenate was dangerous, but they then discovered they developed DDT. And DDT was really developed during World War II to defoliate trees and so forth, so the enemy couldn't hide. And so DDT was introduced into agricultural use to kill off insects, and that took the place of lead arsenate. But DDT volume, and in fact, you can see in the book where I trace uh, the actual use of DDT parallels the outbreak of polio virus. Um, and uh, and then in the early 50s, they stopped using DDT. They realized how toxic it was, and the polio rate started to come down. Well, the next year, the Salk vaccine came out, and it was and the decrease was attributed to the vaccine. But in fact, the decline had already started with the cessation of the use of DDT. Uh, Now, that initial vaccine that came out was an injectable vaccine, and unfortunately, it was contaminated. And there was a company called Cutter, manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, and Cutter made contaminated vaccines and actually caused an outbreak of polio, and that's where 200 kids died and several thousand were infected as a result of the release of this Cutter vaccine. Then it was switched to the oral version of the vaccine, and many of us, me included, took it back in the 50s and 60s. That turned out to be contaminated as well. And now you had mentioned the name Bernice Eddy when we talked earlier. Bernice Eddy was a researcher at NIH, and she was taking a look at this vaccine. And what she discovered was that the oral polio vaccine was contaminated by something called SV40. SV40 stands for simian virus 40. And the reason it's the simian virus the way it got in there is that the way the vaccines were made is they were cultured on monkey kidneys. Monkey kidneys turned out to be a rich culture environment to grow the virus. And that's how they grew the virus that was then put into the vaccine. Unfortunately, didn't realize that it was contaminated with simian virus. And what's the problem with simian virus? Simian virus is a carcinogen. It can cause cancers in not only monkeys but humans. And so Bernice called attention to this issue. And speaking as we did before, that things that became uh, uh, medically ingrained became law. People were mandated to get these vaccines. She was rocking that boat, and she was lost her laboratory and was fired. It wasn't until a couple of years later that a couple of researchers from, I believe it was Hopkins, also repeated her work and found the simian virus and called attention to it. And they finally stopped then using the oral vaccine, went back to the original injectable vaccine, which we have to this day. And now they have obviously tighter manufacturing standards around that vaccine. So the history of the polio vaccine, is one that speaks volumes about how things in medicine become dogma and how dogma can really do damage because people stop looking for problems.
Yeah. The the polio story is dear to my heart because it's what got me into the whole world, right? And so what changed my entire life on all of this was interviewing Jack Cruz for the first time, and he said, "Well, you need to know if there's SV40." And I was like, "What is SV40?" Right? And so going down in through all of that, what blows my mind is hundreds of millions of doses of that were given out, and that conveniently in 71, Nixon declares the war on cancer, right? So just a little bit after. So now as I better understand, that, SV40 suppresses P53 is a big part of the cause. We now have a modern day Bernice Eddy, in my opinion, in Kevin McKiernan, who has blown the whistle on the whole SV40 promoter. So we have covered that a lot on the podcast, but what I would like your take is, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to you that we have, we go back to, Semmelweis, wash your hands and we'll cut out mortality,
Yes.
right? Eddie, McKiernan, like they're on and on, right? We have so many physicians or scientists that have been canceled. But what does like the modern day Bernice Eddy in what I'm saying McKernan is mean to you and that story?
These individuals, these brave individuals, are really our lifeline. They are willing to go and seek out the truth where dogma exists. And McKernan, for example, as you've discussed, is one of those who discovered this contamination of the COVID vaccines, particularly the Pfizer vaccines and their manufacturing process, which I won't go into the detail of, but in fact uses what's called a circular DNA plasmid to program E. coli cells in big vats to produce the mRNA sequence that ends up going into the vaccines. And unfortunately, when they use these, and these are large multi-thousand gallon vats, it's really quite a witch's brew in there. They do an incomplete job of breaking up the E. coli, of getting rid of all the DNA contamination. And what Kevin McKernan pointed out is that these vials of vaccine are heavily contaminated with this DNA that was used to program these cells, genetically engineer these cells to produce the mRNA. They never got rid of it, and in fact, it's heavily contaminated. And those plasmids contain, among other things, this SV40 as a really a promoter sequence that blocked, as you pointed out, P53, which is a gene that helps surveil our bodies to prevent cancers from developing. And it has a number of other functions. But the SV40 contamination, and Kevin, and still to this day, is being battled. He's really under enormous pressure. And there's tremendous efforts to discredit him and his work, but his work now has been replicated in multiple labs around the world. So it's clearly this is an issue. The company continues to deny it. Unfortunately, the FDA still refuses to recognize this as an issue. This vaccine absolutely should have been pulled from the market years ago. There's no reason to keep it on now.
You bring up being confirmed, right? I talked to Philip Buckholtz about this. He's at South Carolina School of
Yeah,
Pharmacy. He proved it, and when I talked to him, he's like, "I'm not doing a podcast. My school doesn't want me to talk to this." I'm like, that goes to show the problem, right? Like we're not
it
going to
is.
talk about the truth because whoever writes my check says no. How do we navigate? I mean, I think you've done it with your book. I think you've navigated it well. But how do we, as the public, navigate the experts saying one thing and it's discredited, and then we have this quote unquote fringe outside that's going against the grain? What is your thoughts on that?
You can't cure this system from within. You look at what Kennedy's trying to do, and he's battling every day just to get the wins that he's got. He has fought tooth and nail not only by entrenched establishment, the pharmaceutical industry, by Congress and others who have a vested interest. No, this has to be fought from the outside. This has to be the people rising up. And that's what's happening now. And people like you and many others who are broadcasting this information. It's why I'm putting books out. It's why we've got Substacks. It's why we've got all these articles. We've got a growing group of people who are becoming aware of this issue and starting to put some political pressure on the FDA, on their congressmen, and so forth. Mary Talley Bowden, the doc from Houston who they have tried to take her license away because she was treating patients with ivermectin. Um, she is now she's got a whole campaign about congressmen and state senators who are supporting our vaccine initiatives to bring more truth to this topic and to get rid of the COVID vaccine. So there are thousands of actions going on, and this is the only way you can really change. The culture has to change in order for the politicians to change, for the bureaucracies to change. It'll never happen from within. Kennedy, God bless him, he's fighting the battle of his life. But unless we rally the populace around him and apply political pressure, it's just not going to change.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. So what are your thoughts with the brand new announcement? And I don't know in depth with it, but McCullough's Nicholas with McCullough Foundation just posted that a RICO case has been filed against the American pediatrics. Like, so what does that mean? Are we going to get? Is this a big deal? Is it smoke and mirrors? Is this going to be something that breaks the dam and releases the flood? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's RICO is a very powerful tool. It's tough to prove, but it's a very powerful tool insofar as it permits discovery. And discovery is something they are going to fight tooth and nail, and that's where they are. I mean, they've filed to dismiss this case. It will take a very brave judge to proceed with this action. And my experience, most of our experience with judges and vaccines is they totally lack courage. They have no idea what's going on behind the scene. They don't realize how corrupt this all is. But in general, in summary, you can look at the College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. You can look at the AMA, the Internal Medicine Society, and certainly the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics. All of them receive government funding as well as rich donations and grants from the pharmaceutical industries. In fact, if you look at the AMA in particular, I'll distract for a moment and just look at the AMA. AMA generates $300 million a year because the government has granted it an exclusive license for a coding system that all the hospitals and doctors have to use. So in effect, it's a software company with a small membership group attached to it. But it's that membership group, which is only about 10 or 12% of physicians now belong. It's that membership group that gives it credibility. But in fact, its whole purpose in life is to continue its exclusive license with the United States government for its program, its software that does coding and allows billing and so forth. Um, so it will do whatever the government tells it to do. The American Academy of Pediatrics also heavy grants from pharmaceutical industry, as well as in COVID. It actually they received upwards of I think $6 or $7 million to promote the COVID vaccine. They're not about to go and take a hard look and see whether or not the manufacturing process was correct and whether there was contamination with SV40 or anything else. That wasn't on their mind. Their idea was to push the vaccines out there, and that's still what they do. And unfortunately, they have enormous power over pediatric practices because most pediatric practices now are parts of larger groups, and those groups are under enormous pressure to conform to whatever the FDA is saying or the CDC is saying they should be complying with.
Unbelievable. The entire reality of what's going on is absolutely unbelievable. Um, and it's been bought hook, line, and sinker by so much of the population. It's just it's hard to fathom. So I want to go into this because I did not quit. My dad is a pharmacist. I did not question vaccines. I worked EMS 10 years. I I didn't question it. Right. I saw the miracles that we did with trauma, or acute issues, even cardiac arrest, dysrhythmias, blah blah blah. But then the flip side of that was the chronic disease was everybody. Why does everybody have diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiac disease, right? And so a lot of these things just started coming together when my little boy was diagnosed with cancer. And it was just this huge gut punch and attempting to understand. So he we did he's my oldest. We did everything the pediatrician told us. My grandmother's a nurse, right? Like everything that we were supposed to do when we got vaccines, we would alternate Tylenol, ibuprofen every 2 hours to make sure he didn't get a
Yeah,
fever. We did formula, we did rice cereal because he kept spitting up. In hindsight, I just want to like just scream. But
of course.
we did everything that we were supposed to, and he ends up with stage 4 cancer. Okay. And fast forward, I have 4 kids. My youngest isn't vaccinated at all. She is by far the healthiest, just turned 5. by far the healthiest out of the others. And then, with the third one, not as many. My second one, she was fully vaccinated up until 8 or 7, whatever. But it is eye opening as somebody that gets to see four different kids, same blood, and how different everything has played out. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's quite clear that the families that I know who have not vaccinated their kids, they have there's virtually no allergies, no autism for sure. The kids are healthy and vibrant, and you can tell the difference. I mean, you talk to Paul Thomas, the pediatrician from Portland. I don't know if you've had a chance to interview Paul, but Paul ran a very busy pediatric practice in Oregon, and he actually kept track of all of his patients, obviously, several thousands of patients over the years. And he actually was able to compare his unvaccinated kids with his vaccinated kids. And as a result of publishing that information, the state of Oregon took his license away and forced him out of practice. But his research is really interesting because there's a ground level. I mean, this was the guy who actually did the examinations. He was vaccinating if the families wanted to. If they didn't want to, he didn't force them to. So he really had excellent data. And he was quite clear that his unvaccinated kids were much more vibrant. They had much lower rates of allergies, ear infections, um, autoimmune disorders, diabetes, and so forth, eczema, all of these things that are immune related. They were much healthier as a cohort. And the same thing now we're finding the Henry Ford study that has now finally found a publisher for the data that was available through the work of the Children's Health Defense Initiative. Um, that confirmed really what Paul found in his few thousand patients. They had, I think, 50,000 or so patients they could look at, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, during their a few years up till age 9, I think it is. They tracked them. Same results. They had very much the same findings that these kids were much healthier overall and didn't have the chronic disorders that the vaccinated kids did. Again, that story, just like Paul's, this guy, Paul had the courage to actually publish his work. The researcher at Henry Ford said, I can't publish this. I'm going to lose my job. And so, but that data has been obtained, has been analyzed and published. And it's quite clear that these kids are much healthier who were unvaccinated.
What I want to go maybe a little deeper layer and get your thoughts on this, because I think that we have a lot of things going wrong, right? I think this is just one aspect of it. I think our environment, right? The technological environment that we have an artificial environment. We don't experience natural light. We don't experience temperature swings. We don't experience circadian rhythms, right? And I think that when we look at this, this is in my opinion, when we start looking back at a lot of embryology, we're not developing babies properly, right? And this you can go back to Claude Shannon's work, right, in morphology, that Sheldrake. Like, there's so many things that can kind of go into why I'm saying that, but because of the environment that we are in, sperm, eggs, all of it coming together, and how that baby's growing, there are a lot of broken places that can happen, and a vaccine can exacerbate wherever that break is. So to me, like, we still have a lot of work to do outside of even discussing vaccines. And when cancer is my world. This was, Dr. Petra is who connected us. That this is what we work on to cancer every single day, right? We are not seeing the success in people that are unwilling to change their environment. And I think that's a really, really important thing. If people aren't getting better in the same environment they have gotten sick in, and we have a break because of an ad, whether it's mRNA or other vaccines or poor diet, blah blah blah. I think there's a lot of things that go into that. The environment piece, how important is that for you and your lens? And I'm just crazy in what I just threw out there.
Yeah, listen, again, it's been a process of discovery for me and many other physicians who were conventionally trained. We had no insight, given no insight whatsoever, sharing of information related to our environment and how important that was in developing healthy children and having a healthy life. Remember, our food pyramid had cereal at the top. So, so, I mean, that's the environment we grew up in, and heavily, the vaccine really surged. I mean, we had some vaccines in up through the 60s and 70s, but really in the 80s, it really all took off, and because there was no liability anymore for the manufacturers. So, and we're still in that mode right now. Although, unfortunately, I mean, the FDA did back off some of the standard drugs on the list, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But fortunately, we're seeing some reversal of that now. But it was never about. It was very little about food, and what we understood about food was probably wrong. We had seed oils were used to fry all kinds of things, and all of the packaged foods, commercially available products and snacks and things, just terrible for you. And so I think there is so clearly, personally, and in my family and my children and my grandchildren, that's very high up on the list. So they have a healthy skepticism of vaccines, and they are all completely dedicated to healthy foods, exercise, sunlight. It's marvelous to see. Um, when I was growing up, we actually, I think, almost incidentally lived healthy lives. In that, back in the day, you could go out on your bike and wander the neighborhoods and not worry about, and show up for dinner at night, and you were safe. The kids are so protected now and coddled. It's tough for them to explore on their own and get a few bruises and fall out of a tree and so forth and build a fort and then do that sort of thing. All of those things were incredibly healthy activities. So yes, personally, I'm a devotee of that. Certainly, my co-author Jeff Barkey is a holistic practice where the last thing he thinks about is medicine. He's looking at alternatives. He's very big on going into grocery stores and educating people about healthy foods, how to find the look at the ingredients, what's important to look at, and so forth. So yeah, I think this evolution is happening. I think the whole Maha movement is helping to drive it. I do give a lot of credit to Kennedy for that. That may be his major victory when all is said and done about sort of changing the content and labeling of foods.
I think, yeah. I I just wish that they would get down a little deeper too, right? Like instead of stopping way too often, in my opinion, in the conversation, it is seed oils and it's red 40, right? It's like it's so much deeper. I'm gonna give you this a little bit of a case study. So I have a good friend, just diagnosed melanoma. Uh, Diabetic, overweight, all these things going on. So what I told him, right, is you have got to get outside of your office, not sit on a computer all day, right? You need to see the sunrise. You need to do fasting, some extended fasting. You need to absolutely be in the sun. What the sunlight does, the full spectrum, unpolarized light, that is a huge conversation in of itself. Cold therapy, and his A1C has dropped significantly. He's dropped about 45 pounds. He's not doing anything just absolutely crazy. Like he's not doing like 30-degree cold plunges, right? It's
Yeah.
it's cold enough to kind of gasp and long enough to shiver a little bit. His He's doing really, really well, right? And we're not doing anything crazy, as
Hmm.
far as, this wild alternative therapy or ayahuasca in the jungle. It's straight up some lifestyle timing light things. So with those that embrace that, the results are so much better than if you go in for Keytruda, right? So what are you seeing have the biggest benefits? If I'll interject one more thing, Southern California and New Jersey have the highest rates of autism. Graphically, there's nothing similar. They're on opposite ends of the country, different latitudes, but they have a similar autism rate. I think that we should be paying attention to the environment of what Southern California and New Jersey is more than some of these other things. So, with that said, the lifestyle stuff, how important is that? Do you think that maybe where we live geographically has a huge factor on us as well?
Well, sure. I mean, let's go back to sort of what the naturopathic approach might be to a cancer. Uh, most melanomas, for example, people would say, "Oh no, you got to stay out of the sun." Well, in fact, melanoma typically comes from bad sunburn, repeated sunburn, and other factors uh, in our diet and so forth, and uh, as its source. And in fact, the healthy things you described, I would absolutely encourage. Um, and most people don't realize that uh, why dropping your A1C works. This is a fascinating aspect of cancer biology. Cancer cells actually have a different system of generating energy. They are completely glucose dependent. They can't, for example, when you fast, you actually switch from glucose consumption uh, to to uh, fatty acid consumption that uh, that that changes how your cell metabolizes and makes energy. Um, glucose, but cancer cells are completely dependent on glucose. If you starve them of glucose, that is sugar, and you put somebody, for example, on a keto diet with very restricted carbohydrates, you'll not only lose weight, but you destabilize the cancer. And ultimately, the way cancers go away is that your immune system has to take them out. Talk about chemotherapy, radiation therapy, whatever you want to do, all of that is allowing, if and when it works, and there's a big if about that, it's allowing your immune system has to take over and ultimately sweep it away, get rid of it. It's never killed outright by these modalities of chemotherapy and radiation. They are there to weaken the cancer. Unfortunately, they also weaken your immune system and its ability to recover and finish the job. So that's why things like naturopaths are doing more natural cures, starving cancers of glucose, like your friend is doing with your colleague. The other thing that is being introduced are things like ivermectin therapy into the mix, along with some other medications like mebendazole um, as a treatment for cancer. Those are also directed at weakening the cancer cell and its metabolism, and allowing your immune system to kick in and take over and control that cancer. There have been enormous successes with the use of these alternative methods, but just as with the McKiernan and others who are discovering flaws in the vaccine, there's enormous pushback and resistance. Obviously, this is a $500 billion industry in the U.S. alone. Is the chemotherapy business, and the hospitals are heavily dependent on this revenue, and therefore it's going to be very difficult to get the research done, get through to the truth about the use of these alternative methods.
The money side of it, and I know all too well, is honestly, it's just disgusting. So I wanna go back a little bit on the cancer topic. Melanoma is very interesting to me in that the correlation with hypothyroidism and Parkinson's is so high. Huge connection there, and to me, what is fascinating is that it seems to be a oxygen and iron dysregulation. It messed up on the metabolism. And so you brought in the ketogenic diet approach, the metabolic approach. Naisha Winter, she's a dear friend. She wrote the book. Seafried's been on a couple times. So when we were having this conversation, we're still seeing some outcomes not real good with even a ketogenic approach with everybody. And I think this is what goes back to what I was asking you about on geography, right? Is like if we don't have the morning infrared light, the TCA cycle doesn't spin clockwise. Therefore, there's no beta oxidation. no beta oxidation on a high fat diet is a big problem, right? So, like when we're seeing people in at a high latitude doing ketogenic diets without embracing cold and without embracing light, we're not getting the results that we otherwise should, right? And we also don't look at how iron charge states, right? Plus three, plus two. We don't want it into plus three if we're wanting to transport oxygen. So now we're under these blue lights that actually put it into a plus three state. So I say that to say the inability to function properly based on the environment we are is dictating whether modalities are working or not. And that is a really, really important factor, in my opinion, on what is going to work or not work. But if we're not all having a conversation around some of these little things that seem insignificant, but they actually may be, our Dunning Kruger moment, we're going to be in trouble and we're going to continue getting lackluster results, especially post mRNA when everything has changed.
Yeah, we are going to see and already are seeing a wave of cancers in young people. In particular, you're seeing advanced cancers, stage 4 cancers, and things that normally occur in older adults. In children, I agree. I think we're in for a wave. I the key. The problem is with these theories is that it's very tough. We do need data. We do need some data on this, and we should be pouring money and resources into this. And there is some of that effort going on. I know the state of Florida has put some in. I know the NIH is committing some money to these studies, but not nearly enough to understand what how these other factors that need to be considered in both preventing cancer as well as then curing cancer. And so we're going to have this awful lag where we're going to continue to have. I think we're on right now, excess cancer is running close to 20% a year at this point. It's not showing any signs of slowing down. So we have basically paralyzed the immune systems of millions of people and paralyze their cancer detection systems. You mentioned P53, BRCA gene is another one. And this is the reason why I believe that people who have been vaccinated are at risk of cancer. And and uh, and this trend is going to continue, unfortunately, and it's going to be in the younger generations.
And yeah, I mean, we're seeing it, like, right? Like we're seeing it. So you do a great job in going in, especially in your previous book, on discussing kind of mercury and aluminum as essentially their mitochondrial toxins. But even within this, we have these positively charged lipid nanoparticles within the mRNA that are a mitochondrial disaster themselves. Mitochondria are negatively charged or absorbing these lipid nanoparticles. So when you take that and you couple it with like the work of Doug Wallace, right? Heteroplasmy and when what's going on with he's done great work on autism too and cancer. But what we're doing to the mitochondria is an all-on onslaught, and everything that we've talked about in this conversation directly impacts mitochondrial function. So is that something within your practice that you give some kind of credence to? Everybody needs to read your book and understand both of them. But do you look at, for lack of a better term, a mitochondrial medicine approach, even though you haven't directly said it? It's kind of what I feel.
Sure. Well, there's no direct measure for that. There are indirect measures of mitochondrial function. I think what we've seen is that the healthy lifestyles uh, and that we've been talking about are your best bet at maintaining mitochondrial effectiveness and duration. Um, and there are things like methylene blue and others. I know Kennedy takes that. That's really helps mitochondrial function and so forth. So if you're under stress and so forth, there are things that you can take that seem to help that. My major practice right now, frankly, is focused on people who are COVID vaccine injured. And so mitochondrial dysfunction is all part of that mix. But our task and challenge is actually getting rid of the spike proteins. These spike proteins are persisting now over 4.5 years out from the original vaccinations. Very high levels, which we now can measure. We can measure at least the antibody response to those levels. And our focus is very much on helping some of these people restore function and get rid of the spike proteins. I know Peter McCullough is heavily involved in that. They actually have a product out. I use a different sort of approach than Peter does. We overlap in some ways. Um, but all of this, ultimately, the mitochondrial function is terribly important, obviously, to these cells, to having healthy cells, and to recovering from injury and from cancer. But that's not a particular focus of my practice.
So, you bring up Spike. John Catanzaro, Dr. Catanzaro, he's a friend too. He's been on multiple times. He's got a big focus on well, gene integration and then the spike protein. So, just kind of seeing results all over the board and elevated spike protein levels in people that didn't even get the vaccine, which is alarming, actually, right? So is two things: is how important is it to understand shedding and the potential of shedding, and what is actually working best in your experience at lowering spike level load?
Yeah, I mean, shedding's a real phenomenon. My wife and I did not get the vaccine, and we tested for the presence of spike protein, at least the antibody response. Mine was close to zero. Um, Hers was actually slightly elevated, and our theory behind that is that they were shedding. And I know she was working her job, her career was college counseling, working with kids that are interested in going to college, and all these kids got vaccinated. And so our theory is that she actually there was shedding going on that she was exposed to. Uh, and people that I'm taking care of now who had the vaccine, they are running extremely high levels of spike antibody. And some of them are heavily symptomatic. Some of them are asymptomatic. The concern with obviously is that it's unhealthy to have this level of immune reaction going on, to have these spikes stimulating an immune response. We've got to bring down the spike levels because this is not going to bode well over time. It's going to degrade the immune system. It's probably going to affect brain and other organs, kidneys and so forth. So we haven't even yet seen the full spectrum of what's in store for people who've been vaccinated. In terms of getting it, dealing with the spikes, the approach we've taken is a little bit of mix of what Peter McCullough is doing, where he uses nattokinase, curcumin, bromelain, and a few other things. I have had success using N-acetylcysteine. And in fact, there's a particular one called augmented N-acetylcysteine. It's made in Switzerland, um, and there are now U.S. distributors for it. Seems to be very effective at reversing. When I say effective, it takes a long time to bring down the spike because you have no natural mechanisms in your body for detoxifying the mRNA or the spike. They're completely unnatural. And so the cleanup of that, it has to be helped. And so we think sort of N-acetylcysteine can denature the spike proteins and then allow your body to clean it up. But you've got to have a way of breaking it down that the body currently doesn't have.
Is NAC a sulfur compound?
Yes.
Well, it's part of the biophysics of that. I think that's fascinating that you found the that is bringing it down. That's a that's that's
So,
brilliant.
so time will tell. I mean, what we're seeing is if I can get about a 20% decline in the spike antibody level, I know I'm moving everything in the right direction because it's a lagging indicator. So we know that means the spike has come down much more quickly. The antibody tends to last a little bit longer. And so I'm tracking, we do periodic spike antibody tests, which is how we discover this, and track the spike antibodies.
I can see where that would be much more effective than Mercola's protocol. 'Cause I know a lot of people on that, and it's not working that great, for many of them. And I think it's not an enzyme problem. Spike is an electromagnetic interference for the entire system. It just throws everything off. Just the communication, the coherence. And I think this is where, the interview I just did with Pierre Corey is epic. And it's because he has bridged into this world of water and coherent domains and how,
Yes, right.
it's light, ultra weak biophotons, all that stuff is real, right? And that's another thing that's been suppressed and we're not allowed to talk about it because it's woo woo, but it's real. And spike protein throws off the coherence of absolutely every bit of that. And so that I love that you told me that for one, and that it's it's got my head spinning a little bit, but I'm very excited. So what's next for you? What's on the agenda coming up?
Well, we're trying to get the word out about the book. We're trying to speak as many people as we can about this information. Most adults have no idea. They walk into their doctor's office and he's pushing 4 vaccines on them. They walk into the pharmacy to pick up a medication, and all of a sudden the pharmacist is in your face saying, "Gee, you're due for COVID and flu and RSV." So what we're trying to do is get the word out. I'm hoping the book will help to do that, and these interviews are important in getting the word out so that people can become more educated consumers of healthcare. And that's ultimately, as I mentioned before, the change has to happen at the grassroots level. It's not going to happen from the top.
It does. So what you kind of spurred a thing. I think of a family member. I'm not going to name because it'd be really easy to pinpoint who they are if I do. She's listened to everything that she's supposed to have done, right? Every new I haven't even heard of some of these vaccines for adults. It's blowing my mind. Like pneumococcal, you have the shingles. It's
Mhm.
just something every time you turn around and has done every one of them and is an absolute train wreck. So like it's very timely for your book and the work that you're putting out. How who has been we'll wrap up with this. Who has been the most receptive to this message because, like, when I hear things like, "Well, if I wouldn't have got it, it would have been way worse." Well, let me tell you something. I worked on an ambulance and I've pulled up on hundreds of car wrecks, and some of them that I knew they were going to be dead were standing beside the car directing traffic, and others where it did look
Yeah,
like a minor fender bender and they
yeah.
are dead, right? So, like, it is insane to me that anybody ever says how it would have turned out. But what, what's your breakthrough way of communicating that?
Well, it is unfortunately it's as much an emotional issue as it is. In fact, it's a more of an emotional issue than a scientific issue. Again, remember, we're fighting dogma. I also think there are political distinctions here. I mean, I don't want to get into politics, but the fact of the matter is that those that have greater trust in government and the beneficence of government are less inclined to listen to anything that runs contrary to mainstream uh, uh, discussions of vaccines and drugs and chemotherapy and everything else. So I find the ones that are most open to it are the ones that are skeptical about government and that government has our interests at heart and has to have a healthy skepticism about the information they read and see. Those are the easiest ones to get through. I have had some breakthrough in others that were really recalcitrant to begin with, but as they heard more and more information, and some of them had personal experience with family members who might have had a bad reaction, all of a sudden are a little bit more interested in listening. So I'm hopeful that we can continue to convert people over to open their minds and to become educated. But I do find a divide that mostly runs along political lines at this point.
Unbelievable how everything has became political. But
Yeah,
look,
yeah,
Dr. Gear, thank you so much for your time and your work. I'm telling everybody about this book now. So grateful that Petra connected us and thank you.
I'm as well. Wonderful to speak with you today. Best of luck.